Good morning, and welcome to Sunday Forum. We're so glad you're here, not only those of you here in the chapel, but those of you watching online. We're just delighted that you're with us. One of the blessings of a building like this is that it's seen a lot of history. The stories coming from that history are some of the threads that weave us with a sense of place and belonging as a faith community. I'm sure we've all admired these chapel windows as we've been in this space for all kinds of different occasions and been impressed with their bright colors and their artistry. But I'm sure we'll all look at them in a different way after Greg shares with us the story behind them. And Greg Vanell is the perfect person to do this. Having been an engaged Plymouth member for over 20 years, he's soaked up a lot of Plymouth history and has been a volunteer and member of the Archives Committee for some 5 years and is also a docent with the Fine Arts Board. Greg, we're grateful for you to share this piece with us.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. For those, probably very few of you who don't know me, I am Greg Vanell, and I am actually more than a 30-year member of Plymouth. And I'm one of the volunteer archivists, have been for about six and a half years. It's one of the things I wanted to do as soon as I retired. I always had in the back of my mind that I wanted to join the team in the archives as soon as I retired, so that's what I did. From the beginning, much of the work that I've done in archives involved transcribing handwritten meeting minutes of the church's various meetings, all the way from the very beginning in the mid-1850s up until the early 1900s. But a few years ago, about 5 years ago maybe, pre-pandemic, Plymouth received 3 large cartons. Is this, Alex, is this just a little bit loud? Can everybody hear me without getting feedback? Okay. We received 3 large cartons of documents and letters from a stained glass window company in Winona, Minnesota. After a merger with the Willet stained glass company in Philadelphia, all of these records had been digitized and were no longer needed. They sent them up here and asked, did Plymouth want them? Well, the answer, of course, was a resounding and emphatic yes. So I had the opportunity over the next weeks and months to go through all of these letters, many of which we had copies of in our own records, but I was matching up original copy with a carbon copy and a carbon copy with an original copy, so that once everything was put in chronological order, we had a very good sequence of events of what took place when these windows were being contemplated. The boxes contained all of the correspondence between Plymouth Church and the Willet Stained Glass Company during the planning and installation of all of these windows that we're surrounded by this morning. So these beautiful windows that are all around you have been here since 1949. Most, if not all of you, have been in this room and you've seen the windows. But even though you've seen them, have you really seen them? And do you really know what it took to get them here? So we'll have a look at them, some in detail and others in not so much, just primarily due to time. We'll look at them perhaps in a way that you've not done before. And my hope is that when we leave here in a little while this morning, I'll hear some of you walking out of the room saying, I never knew that. I will be able to zoom in on, let me get going here again. This thing decides to. Okay, I will be able to zoom in on some of the slides and show greater detail of these windows, but we're going to be real informal. If the Spirit moves you, feel free to get up and walk and look at the actual windows. I'll point out the ones we're talking about, where they're located in the room. And, I hope that you'll be able to see some of the great amount of detail that went into these windows. The story of these chapel windows is the story of two men who did not know each other in late 1949, or 48 actually, but who became fast friends over 35 years through the process of creating and installing all of these windows, as well as other windows in Plymouth. Howard Conn, the senior minister at Plymouth Church, and Henry Lee Willet, the president of the Willet Stained Glass Company in Philadelphia. That company was actually founded by Henry Lee's parents in the 1890s as a sort of a protest against the opalescent pictorial windows that were all the rage at the turn of the century. And since, by coincidence, this building was built and dedicated at the turn of the century, I've got an example of that type of window. This is one of our transept windows from the sanctuary. And if you zoom in, you can kind of see that each one is almost like an image that you would see looking through a picture window. It's an outdoor scene, landscape, very colorful. And as the detail here says that it's just like taking a photograph of an outdoor scene, so that most of these figures are what you would see by looking out the window. These Willet's windows, as we'll see, the windows around the room here, were of a style that comes close to the medieval glass of European cathedrals. There are no fields of opalescent whiteness, the entire openings being filled with jewel-like glass of many colors, hundreds of tiny pieces leaded together in intricate patterns. So it's a complete switch in style, not only for the industry itself, but for the windows that began being put into Plymouth. Early in Howard Conn's ministry in Connecticut and Massachusetts, he had a dream of building his own church. And in that church, he envisioned a series of windows that would depict the seasons of the Christian year. By the time he came to Plymouth in 1944 from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, he had come to understand that his original dream would probably not be realized. But when plans were developed for the construction of a chapel at Plymouth, Howard saw his opportunity, and he began planning the windows that you see around the room here. Plymouth had a building committee for the chapel, which did the research and provided a list of stained glass studios. References were obtained from churches and buildings across America, touting the artists that created those windows. In August of 1948, Howard Conn writes an introductory letter from his summer home in Massachusetts to Henry Lee Willet, describing the chapel window concept and saying that Willet has been highly recommended by several people, and makes an initial inquiry to meet Willet and discuss the project. 4 days later, Henry Lee Willet writes Howard Conn, proposing a meeting date, and suggests that he would show Howard his studio and take him around the area to show his glass in several nearby churches. Some people on the building committee had received information about Willet's previous work that was not complimentary, and there was some disagreement among the building committee that Willet was the right studio and the right person to provide Plymouth with its chapel windows. But Howard Conn had formed a personal connection with Henry Lee Willet and felt that Willet would do the job the way it was envisioned. In fact, Howard had come to feel that Henry shared his vision for these windows. So Howard recommended Willet over the reservations of the consultant and 2 of the members of the building committee. Other information supported Willet, and Howard's recommendation was approved by the building committee and the trustees. And it was, after all, Howard's vision. And now, looking around the room, it's rather hard to imagine that anyone else could have done these. And if the windows here don't convince you, Willet's body of work should. It includes windows in places like the Cadet Chapel at the U.S. Military Academy in West Point, the Church Center at the United Nations in New York City, the National Cathedral in Washington, the Cadet Chapel at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, the chapel at Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia, the chapel at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., and the VFW National Memorial in Washington. And then closer to home here, some of his work appears in Westminster Presbyterian Church and Hennepin Avenue Methodist Church, and in St. Paul, the House of Hope. So you can see other examples of his work here in town. And just looking around the room, would anybody care to venture a guess what the 1948 cost of these windows might have been? The original cost quoted by Henry Lee Willet was $750 for each of these individual lancets. And I'm going to grab something. I should have pulled it out of my briefcase here, but I want to grab a little show and tell thing here. Yes. So here is the original quote that we received in November of 1948 from Willet to Plymouth, expressing their plan and an estimate for the windows, the proposal. And they said, "We agree to make and set in place in the new chapel of Plymouth Congregational Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the following windows for the sum of," any guesses? Well, $14,000 in total. That included the 3 lancet chancel window, 15 lancets around the room, the rose window up in the gallery, which is kind of up and behind you, and the 3 lancet narthex window, the Paul windows over on the sidewall. And initially, this quote did not include what we've referred to as the Ministry of Mercy windows, the 6 windows that are on the screen between the chapel and the narthex. So the chancel window up above the chancel was paid for from the general fund of Plymouth, and the others were all paid for by memorial gifts. Another glassmaker had quoted $3,500 for the chancel window and $1,200 for each of the lancets. And since the makers seemed to be of equal ability, there was no reason for us to pay the higher amount. And Henry Lee assured Plymouth in his quote that Plymouth would have the finest workmanship and materials to make them the equivalent of the medieval glass artists which have stood the test of centuries. You might agree that he hit the nail on the head. On November 12th of 1948, Conn wrote to Willet with the church days that he had planned to portray. The sketch of the Pentecost window was the first to be done and had been sent to Conn for a meeting of the advisory window committee. Conn spoke of the 17 church members who were on that committee. They were to make suggestions as to the iconography, pass on the sketches submitted by Willet, and educate the congregation as to the thought behind the chapel windows. Let's see here. Move on down. This slide shows some work of the designer of the windows, who worked with the Willet studio for some 60 years. I think I tried to figure out the math, and she started working when she was 22. She worked for 60 years before her death at age 80. So she never married. This was her life, so to speak. She had kind of a funny sense of humor, and many of her windows had little jokes or things worked in. And if this is a window, and I'm not sure where it was put in, but it's a window that she had designed previously, showing a church organist pounding away on his organ. But if you'll notice, down in the corner, here's our little buddy Schroeder. No reason for it other than just to give people a chance to chuckle a little bit when they look at it. So this is Marguerite Godin. The sense of humor that she had, is that I mentioned, continued into other works. In one window, which was the subject of the Garden of Eden, she had a cross-eyed worm popping out of an apple. And at St. Luke's Episcopal Cathedral in Orlando, Florida, she had oranges portrayed in a window, and they are marked color added. In December of '48, the first letter from Henry Lee Willet to Howard Conn, outlining some ideas for several of the windows, providing suggestions and asking for approval. Willet showed himself to be extremely knowledgeable of Christian stories and iconography. It is likely that many of the ideas that he came up with were from earlier windows that he might have designed for other churches. And he wanted to pattern his ideas closely with Plymouth, as well as Congregationalism in general. So he asked pointed questions of Howard that would allow this. For example, for the Epiphany window, which is behind you, the one on the right of the two Epiphany windows. In your church, he asked, how do you hold the infant, or do you hold the infant when you baptize it? And how are you garbed? Is there a print available of your font? So he wanted to have the detail as closely as possible. And for the Christmas window, he asked, is it all right to introduce the Moravians with their Christmas caroling? What about Tiny Tim as interest for children? Considering the congregational background, how about the Pilgrims landing on Pilgrim Rock almost on Christmas Day? And we might use conventional holly on the border. And Howard's response was, no Moravians, agreeable to have Tiny Tim, no on the Pilgrims, since they will be in the Thanksgiving window. Holly is okay, also maybe mistletoe and poinsettia. So they traded off, they bounced ideas and thoughts off of one another. Let's see here. Now we're to the chancel window. The first window plans were for the worldwide communion window above the chancel. Howard sent to Henry Lee a letter with a description of what should appear in each of the three lancets. He wanted depictions of several scriptures and other inscriptions, including the inscription, "Christians hold the world together," and symbols of the four evangelists. So, the images that came out in this window show the various ways in which Christians hold the world together. All right, let me get 777. Now, the Advent window. It's March of 1949. Howard Conn wrote to the son of Henry Stimson, a former minister of Plymouth Church, "These windows will tell the story of the Christian year, giving both the biblical incident and the modern application for each of the seasons." There are some good examples of this. In the Advent window, the Archangel Gabriel and Mary are at the top, and Advent is at the far end behind you. And if anyone cares to, I'll see if I can expand this a little bit. The Archangel and Mary are at the top. The central figure is John the Baptist. In the lower panel is a contemporary scene of a small boy helping his father trim the Christmas tree while the mother prepares a creche. So it's section down here. Another example of this concept is the Christmas window. And I'm sorry for sticking my fingers in here, but there we go. The top section shows the message of the angels to the shepherds, Christmas being right next to Advent, again back on the end here. The center section is the nativity scene. And since Christmas is a time when we find joy in doing for others, the lower panel shows a group of people spreading cheer in a hospital ward. Also, and now we can see that scene. Where are we here? Right there. And at the very bottom, as the graphic shows when I reduce that again, Scandinavian tradition held that the Christmas season would last as long as you could keep your Yule log burning. So the thought was to get the biggest darn Yule log you could find and bring it into the house and keep it burning as long as possible. So they depict a man dragging a Yule log home, and then there's the aforementioned Tiny Tim riding on Bob Cratchit's shoulders down in the lower right corner. All right. Where are we here? 14 I want to go to. Taking these things kind of out of order here. Again, March of 1949, after the 17-person advisory committee had reviewed the detailed sketches sent by Henry Lee Willet, Howard Conn sent a letter detailing the committee's response to each one of the sketches. Most of them were positive, with only a few minor criticisms involving small details. But for the Good Friday critique, Howard wrote, and this is a quote taken from his letter, "It is difficult to describe the criticism of our people with regard to the crucified Christ as you depict him, but their reaction was almost unanimous. They felt that the legs of the figure are too feminine and dainty, and that he seems to be garbed in what looks like an advertisement for modern feminine underwear." I looked and looked through all the papers and the documents, and I couldn't find a copy of that original sketch. So we'll just have to let our imaginations suffice. Now, I'm just going to show you an example of Easter. Just with a little indication of some of the depictions that are on that. And then I'm going to move up and show you what Easter and Good Friday are down on the end here. And they were intentionally designed. If you look closely, you'll see that the design of the two windows is identical. The imagery is different in each one, but the design is the same. But the intention was to deliberately show the crucified Christ and the risen Christ next to one another, being the very basis of Christian thought. So by August of 1949, this is not quite a year after Howard's initial letter to Henry Lee Willet, Willet was ordering materials for installation, and he sent a list of things that he needed: 200 pounds of the best linseed oil putty, 50 pounds of dark gray metal sash putty, 1 quart of pure white shellac. So we're starting to get close. And in September, Howard wrote that the window installations were going well, and he commented that Howard's daughter, one of his daughters, had just returned from a year of study in France, and she made the comment, "I have not seen such stained glass since I left Chartres." Pretty complimentary. Now, quickly, we will kind of move into Holy Week, beginning with Ash Wednesday, which shows the 3 temptations of Christ. I thought it was kind of interesting that the original thought was to show a depiction of the actual devil, but they thought that it would be too frightening for children to be looking at, so they did not go ahead with that idea. And Palm Sunday, and then Maundy Thursday, which is actually the single lancet behind you in this far corner. As we know, the night of the Last Supper. And a couple times in past years when I've given a tour of the building after the worship service, we've been in here and people have looked at that window and said, "You know, I'm only counting 11 disciples around the table at the Last Supper." If you look closely, here's the Last Supper. And about 1 o'clock, outside the ring of disciples around the table, you can see the 12th disciple, and that's Judas sneaking away with his bag of silver. So it still carries the biblical implication, but it also a little bit of the whimsy of the designer Marguerite Godin. So end of September 49, Henry Lee Willet wrote that although the dedication of the chapel had been postponed, he wanted to come to Minneapolis to see the windows in place as, quote, "I put a lot of my heart and soul into these." So he planned to come on Friday, September 30th, and leave on Saturday, October 1st. He was not able to stay for the service on Sunday, October 2nd. I'm going to back up for a moment and just go back to the chancel. Although the dedication of the chapel had been postponed, the dedication of a sort of this window took place on October 2nd, and we have a copy of the bulletin from that Sunday morning showing a sketch of the window, October 2nd of 1949. And then inside the bulletin it has a quite detailed write-up on information about this particular window. They wanted to do this dedication of this window because it was the 10th anniversary of the first observance of Worldwide Communion Sunday. So now we're going to go to, although they were not part of the original quote, they became part of the original installation. And these are the windows that appear, 3 on either side of the red doors. It's what we refer to as the Ministry of Mercy windows. I was naked and you clothed me. I was hungry and you gave me food. The shipment here was delivered, and we actually had to send a message to Willet to ask them to trace the shipment because it had not arrived on time. But it did arrive a week later. They kind of have, they're obviously quite a bit different. The lighting isn't as good when I took those photos, but they have the appearance of woodcuts combining strength and charm. There was a notation made that when the original shipment arrived, the naked medallion had a crack in it and was going to have to be replaced. So we're up to November 7th of 1949, the final letter from the building committee chair, Frank Bean, to Henry Lee Willet. And he said, the building committee has been released from further duties. The windows have received universal praise from the Plymouth membership. The return letter from Henry Lee Willet to Bean stated he had spared no effort to fulfill Howard Conn's dream, and he expressed his hope that the windows are and will continue to be a real source of inspiration to all who come to the church to worship. December 29th, 1949, Howard Conn to Henry Lee Willet. I'm sending 6 copies of the newly published Symbolism in Stone and Glass, plus a copy of the front spread of the Minneapolis Tribune for Christmas Sunday, which featured the Plymouth Chapel windows. And wouldn't you know it, we have a copy of, actually we've got 2 or 3 upstairs. And they're not in the best shape, but front page of the Minneapolis Tribune. I'll keep these up here, and if somebody wants to take a closer look later on when we're done, certainly can. The editor of the newspaper at the time was also a Plymouth deacon, and he tried to get the Christmas windows as a Christmas feature in Life magazine, but Life had already planned as its Christmas art spread the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And as the editor, Bill Stevens, said, we were really crowded out by the big league. One thought that came into my mind as I went through all these documents and letters and paperwork, sketches and so forth, is that I found it rather amazing that all of these communications were accomplished so quickly, given that it was 1948 and 1949, and It was all done by mail, and probably train mail rather than airmail wasn't a commonplace thing. And there were no email, there was no JPEGs, no PDFs. But from that very first letter that Howard Conn wrote to Henry Lee Willet, he got his response 4 days later. So it went out to Philadelphia, got the return letter written, and came back. So pretty amazing to me at the time. And by the time the chapel windows had been installed, and through the process of planning all of these windows and several subsequent windows here in Plymouth, Howard and Henry Lee and their families had developed a very deep friendship. They spent time in each other's homes. There were letters in our files and in the files that we received from Willet. Things like Henry Lee Willet saying, well, I'm going to be in Omaha and I need to go back to Philadelphia. I'm going to see if I can route myself through Minneapolis and spend a day with you. So there were always things like that. Howard's wife, Viola, who some of you may remember, and Henry Lee's wife, Muriel, often corresponded. Some of their letters were part of our files. And the Willet daughters, Ann and Zoe, and the Conn daughters, Connie and Janet, also became friends. And here we go again. Sorry about that. Yeah. So just as kind of a side note, after the chapel windows were installed in late 1949, between 1958 and 1986, Willet Studios designed and installed 7 additional windows in the Plymouth building. In 1958, they did the Woolman window, which is in the sanctuary hallway between sanctuary and the tower entrance. The Love window in 1960, which is the window that is just behind the stairway in the sanctuary that goes up to the balcony. It's partially obscured. The William Law window in 1961, which is in the Guildhall hallway. 1964, the Arthur Jennings window in Guildhall. 1966, the choir window, also in Guildhall. 1981, the Hovland window, which is much more of a kind of an abstract window that appears next to the doors that go out to Nicollet Avenue by the gallery. And in 1986, the Howard Conn window in Guildhall. Henry Lee Willet died in 1983, so his son Crosby became president of the company, and he worked directly with Plymouth and Vivian Jones at the time and their committee to work out the details of the Conn window. Since all of these windows were done, the Willet Studios, I think in 1977 actually, were acquired by a company in Winona, which is another renowned stained glass window company, the Hauser Glass Company. So, and that's where we got all these cartons of documents from. So I'm going to take a moment and just put up some of the windows that we haven't had time to talk to, because I do want to provide a little bit of time for any questions that people might have. And we just unfortunately don't have time to talk about every one in detail. There are actually 2 windows devoted to Epiphany, and they're the ones back here behind you. And we call them Epiphany 1 and Epiphany 2. The season of Epiphany celebrates the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles. And tradition also holds that it is the date of the baptism of Jesus. So since both elements are essential to the Christian message, there are 2 windows, one for each emphasis. Let's see what the others are that we... The Pentecost window. And I hope there's time for you to kind of wander around if you choose to really get a good close look up at each of the windows. The Children's Day window, and we've made the comment before that Children's Day is not actually an official point on the Christian season, one of the Christian seasons, but it's almost universally accepted by all Christian churches as one of the most important days in the year. So it's included here. And the Trinity window. Reformation Sunday. All Souls, the Sunday after all, or the day after All Saints. Jane, did you have a question? Or you were given that phony fair catch sign? And then finally, the rose window up above the gallery. And I don't know that my photograph came out any better than, it's probably sharper if you look up at the actual window there. You've heard me mention a couple times during the last few minutes that Howard Conn had been writing a book. He actually finished it just as the last windows were being put in the chapel here. But it's called Symbolism in Stone and Glass. Many of you may have seen it. It's in the library and other places around the church. We have a lot of them down here on the table. And if any of you are interested enough to do a little bit more reading about these windows and other windows in the church that went in before it, feel free to take a copy with you. It's really quite interesting, all the stories that, every window in the church, there's a reason for everything that appears in that window. If a character appears in the window, there's reason for what he's holding in the left hand or what she's holding in the right hand. So, left, right. So it's just, it's been kind of a source of, I've kept that with me as I went through that, all this stuff, all these letters and everything, just so that I could go back and read a little bit more than showed up in the letter. So feel free to grab a copy if you would like. Now, I just am kind of the front person today for this particular presentation, but I wanted to show you, those of us who are on the Archives Committee and the volunteers, just so that you know who we are. And I'm going to put in a shameless plug. We are always looking for more people to help us. We have many projects that need to be worked on. And each one of us has kind of a full plate. We're always working on something. Now that I'm done playing around with this presentation, I'll go back to a couple of other projects that I was working on before that. If anyone is interested at all in joining our team, and we meet generally on Tuesdays, we have a great time together. It's fun, it's interesting, it's very satisfying. If you're interested in history in general or Plymouth history in particular, it's a pretty good deal. So I'm sure that for any of you who might think about doing that, Doreen Bruns, who is our head archivist and kind of our historian, as it were, would love to hear from you. Unfortunately, Doreen was not able to be here today, but I think she's watching online today, so hi, Doreen. She or any one of us on this list here would be happy to hear from you and happy to have you join us up in the archives. So I think that's it. I want to have an opportunity for questions if there are any. We've got just 10 minutes before the service. I don't know if you've been to the early service and are going to the second service, but yes, sir.
Just a note, if you would make.
I look at these extraordinarily intricate, delicate pieces of art and wonder how were they transferred safely from Massachusetts to Minnesota and preserved in that transfer process?
They were completed in Philadelphia, of course, and I'm sure that they were crated up with padding and wood framework around it. Undoubtedly came in either by truck or by train, maybe train, much more likely by train, but I'm sure that they were, a couple of them, there were reference to arriving damage, so a crack here or there that had to be repaired, but other than that, I'm sure that they were just very carefully crated up and protected. But most of them made it intact. Steve?
Yeah, Greg, maybe I missed this part, but how was all this funded? Was this a legacy from somebody, or was this, just funded out of the general offerings
Yep.
and so forth?
The chancel window was paid for out of the general fund of the church, but each of the individual windows, let me go back to an example here. The Thanksgiving window, and I've listed the memorial. So where the memorial money came from. All of the other windows around the room here were paid for by memorial
Okay.
donations.
And another question, when you lead tours, have you ever drawn comments or criticism for these windows being too European-centric? Now, I think they're really cool, and I understand the stories and appreciate them, but in this day and age, you may draw some criticism for that sort of thing. So have you heard any, or has anybody else heard any?
I have not. As I mentioned earlier, when Willet Studios were founded by Henry Lee Willet's parents, it was kind of a protest against the opalescent style that was taking place at the time in the late 1890s and early 1900s. Why they were protesting that, why they didn't care for that, maybe they just had a preference for the medieval type of glass, and that's what they wanted to specialize in. But other than that, I can't tell you I haven't heard any criticisms about the style. I think each stained glass company probably has its own style. Tiffany has its own style, for example. If you were to see a Tiffany window, it would be much different than these. Yes?
Yes. So is it helpful to join your archive team for just like 1 day or 2 days or something like that, or do you need a longer commitment?
Probably best. I want to speak for Doreen, but most of the time we get involved in a project that takes a while to complete. We've gone through files of correspondence from Pauline Baines, who was the designer, the cartoonist that provided the artwork for the embroideries, for example. Elsie, for quite a while, has been going through the Pauline Baines letters. Doreen spent a lot of time going through the Howard Conn correspondence, weeding out. Sometimes there's things that were kept years ago that we don't really need to keep. They were personal letters that just don't really work in with the history of the church. But So I would say in general, most of the time, it would be good to be able to devote enough time to work through a project from week to week.
Okay, like a few months or something? Is
But,
that-
talk to Doreen. Give Doreen a call or send her an email and ask. I'm sure she would
Yeah, it'd be
love
fun
to
get
try to
involved.
work something out. You never say no to a volunteer.
Thank you.
Bill?
Thank you very much, Greg, for doing this and sharing it with us. A couple of questions, or a comment and a question. The windows themselves are beautiful, but I enjoy and the stories they display, but the reflection of the colors on the walls, the frames,
I want to show you one last
it's astounding.
slide.
And I wish we had sun over on this side
Yeah.
to reflect those.
Well, several people have commented on the colors coming through on the side of the openings here.
Right.
This is a quote from Henry Lee Willett's obituary, which I found to be particularly appropriate.
And then my question is, what's your best guess of what this would cost to do these windows in today's dollars?
We have not had the windows in the church appraised since 2010. Was the last time. And at that time, all of the Willet windows, the chapel, and out in the narthex, the total value, instead of $14,000, was $200,000. So it's probably about time for us to have another appraisal. That would be up to Ann Gustafson and Finance and Administration to determine if we need to have another updated appraisal. They would come in and do all of the windows at the same time in the building. So I'm going to let Jackie close, and then I'm going to say if anybody who wants to stick around, I'll be happy to answer more questions if you're not going into the 10 o'clock service. So thank you very much for spending time with us this morning.
Many, many thanks, Greg. We will indeed look at these windows differently now. And as usual, thank you to Alex, who makes all this possible as our technician. And please come back next Sunday when artist Melody Strong, whose art is currently on display in the gallery, will talk about her very personal journey into her parents' lives and her own, growing up as a Latina in Minnesota, and how that journey has given her wisdom to navigate forward. It's certainly worthwhile to take a walk through the gallery, and she's going to be wonderful, I know. Thank you so much, and come again.